Crisis points in empires include assassinations and assassination attempts, as attempts to undermine populist leaders will include both the rumor of assassination and assassinations themselves. This video will explore assassination attempts against the Romanovs and include descriptions from the Romanov sisters of 2015 written by Helen Rappaport. In a rare performance of public ceremony, the Tsar attended the ritual of the blessing of the waters, marking the end of the Christmas festival held on January 6th in the Orthodox calendar. The key moment came when he descended the Jordan staircase of the Winter Palace to the edge of the frozen river Neva in 1905, to witness the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg dip the gold cross into the water 3 times through a hole in the ice in commemoration of the baptism of Christ. After this, a flagon of the sacred water was presented to the Tsar to cross himself with. However, during the traditional gun salute that followed, 3 of the charges fired from the battery on the opposite bank of the Neva proved to be lives, not blanks. One of them smashed into the windows of the Winter Palace's Nicholas Hall, which was crowded with guests, including the Dowager Empress, whom you can learn more about on this channel, and showered grape shot and glass over them and the temporary wooden chapel on the ice in which the Tsar and other dignitaries were gathered. Tsar Nicholas II was unhurt and never moved a muscle except to make the sign of the cross, as one witness recalled, although his quiet, resigned smile seemed almost unearthly. A later investigation suggested it had been a genuine error, reminiscent of the FBI investigating itself today. Shotted cartridges having been left in the breech of the cannon after target practiced. The fatalistic Tsar was, however, convinced that the live shells had been intended for him. For a nation reading catastrophe into every unfortunate incident in the ill-fated last reign of the Romanovs, it was further proof that the autocracy was doomed and marked an era by which the Tsar was fatalist. By 1906, 4 different security networks guarded the Romanovs' every move. The Tsar's escort, backed up by a special police force at Tsarskoye Selo, a specially designed railway battalion monitoring the line from St. Petersburg out to Tsarskoye Selo and Peterhof palaces, and railway lines closely guarded by cordons of troops positioned along both embankments of any route. The Tsarina insisted that the blinds be drawn on train rides, and she refused to allow the children or her husband to go to the windows to wave at Russian citizens. On one such journey, Alexander Mosolov, head of the court chancellery, recalled how the children pressed their faces against the slits on either side beyond the curtain and window frame, hungry for sight of the world beyond. The assassination of General Min so close to home, the Imperial family had been in residence at the Lower Dasha at Peterhof at the time of the assassination, was unnerving for the Tsar, but far more so for the Tsarina Alexandra, who lived in constant fear for his life and the safety of her children. She turned to dosing on aspirin and drinking only carrot juice in this time. On the afternoon of August 12, 1906, Prime Minister and nationalist Stolypin narrowly escaped death when a massive bomb attack on his wooden summer dacha in St. Petersburg, full of visitors at the time, practically demolished the building and killed 30 people, leaving 32 wounded. Stolypin was miraculously unharmed, but as they drug him out of the wreckage, he said, "My poor children, my poor children." 2 of them, his son Arkady and one of his daughters Natalia, who had both been on the balcony of the home, were hurled onto the road below by the explosion. Arkady, who was 3 years old, broke his hip, and his 15-year-old daughter, Natalia, was seriously injured. She lay in hospital in a critical state for weeks. The doctors expected her to die or face the amputation of both of her badly broken legs, but in October a note came from the Tsar telling Stolypin and his wife that a man of God, a peasant from the government of Tobolsk, wished to come and bless Natalia with an icon and pray for her. Nicholas and Alexandra had met the man before, and he had made a distinctly powerful impression on them, so that the Tsar urged his prime minister to let him visit the children in hospital. When he came, the man did not touch the child, just stood at the seat of the bed, holding up an icon of the miracle worker Saint Simeon, and prayed. On leaving, he said, "Don't worry, everything will be all right." Natalia's condition improved soon after, and she recovered, although she was left with a permanent limp because she had one heel blown off. The mysterious healer was a Stranik, a semi-literate 37-year-old pilgrim named Grigory Rasputin, who had been gaining a reputation in St. Petersburg as a mystic and healer since his arrival there during Lent 1903. And you can learn more about Rasputin and the opinions of Grand Duchess Olga Romanov about him on this channel. The Tsar and Tsarina met him briefly in November 1905 at Stana's home, near Peterhof, and saw him there again in 1906. With Philippe now dead, friends of Tsarina Alexandra, the Montenegrin sisters recently adopted Rasputin as their new mystic and healer, and they were steering Rasputin in the highly vulnerable royal couple's direction. Security remained extremely tight when the family took their annual Finnish holiday on the yacht Standart in 1907. All was following its normal pattern until August, when the yacht traveling at 15 knots towards Rappaport with an experienced Finnish pilot on board experienced an accident not far from the port of Hanko. As Tsarina Alexandra's lady-in-waiting Anna Varabova recalled, "We were seated on deck at tea, the band playing, a perfectly calm sea running, when we felt a terrific shock which shook the yacht from stem to stern and sent the tea service crashing to the deck. In great alarm we sprang to our feet, only to feel the yacht listing sharply to starboard. In an instant the decks were alive with sailors, obeying the harsh commands of the captain and helping the suite to look to the safety of the women and children. Although the Standart was not in immediate danger, the captain ordered a speedy evacuation. This prompted a sudden panic for the Tsarevich, who could not be found on deck. He had last been seen playing with the ship's cat and her kittens. The Tsarina went into paroxysms of terror as a frantic search began, only for the boy to appear with his dyadka, or male nanny, Derivenko, who, when the impact had happened, and fearful that the boilers might blow, had gathered Alexei up in his arms and carried him to the prow of the yacht, where it was safer. But the question remained, did the attacker wait to see the Tsarevich visible on board before detonating a bomb? The Tsar remained his usual uncannily impassive fatalist self, calmly calculating the yacht's degree of list and how long they had before it sank, as the outlying escort of some 15 to 20 vessels hurried to the crippled Standart's assistance. With Nikolay Sablin escorting the children to safety, Alexandra regained her composure enough to dash down to her cabin with Anna Varabova and gather up all of her jewels into sheets, as did the Tsar with his important state papers. The yacht was leaning at a 19-degree angle by the time they disembarked. When Sablin and other officers went down into the ship to examine the damage, they found a huge dent in the bottom of the hull, which, if it had been breached, would have caused the yacht to sink quickly. As it was, the ship was tightly secured, and only one compartment had let in any water. The official inquiry into the accident revealed that the rock that caused it was uncharted, surprising since the Russian Navy had a mass of charts, and on subsequent maps it was named after Blomqvist, the unfortunate Finnish pilot who failed to spot it. Members of the crew involved in the swift and speedy evacuation of the family and in the yacht's preservation were rewarded with money, gold, and silver watches and medals. Meanwhile, the accident attracted widespread coverage coverage in the world's press, not adding to the peaceability of the royal family, with newspaper correspondents flocking to Hanko. Considerable shock was registered in the Russian papers, with the finger of blame pointed first at the Finns, then the revolutionaries and burgeoning Bolsheviks, and then the entire Tsarist system. Many were convinced it had been a terrorist attack, and that the yacht had hit a mine, or that a bomb had been planted in her prow. To this day, we still aren't sure. Out in the foyer in 1911, the royal family heard two noises, like the sound of an object falling. Tsar Nicholas later wrote to his mother he thought a pair of binoculars must have fallen on somebody's head from above, and ran back into the box where he was watching ballet with his oldest daughters, Grand Duchesses Olga and Tatiana, to look. To the right I saw a group of officers and others dragging someone. A few ladies were screaming, and there right opposite me stood Stolypin. He turned slowly to face me, and made the sign of the cross in the air with his left hand. Olga and Tatiana tried to restrain their father, but the Tsar instinctively reached towards his prime minister, and he noticed that he had been hit. Stolypin slowly sank into his seat, and everyone rushed to his aid, including Dr. Eugene Botkin, who would die along with the royal family. Stolypin muttered a message for the Tsar, which the minister of the Imperial court brought to him. Your Majesty, Peter Arkadevich has asked me to tell you that he is happy to die for you. I hope there is no reason to talk of death, the Tsar replied. I fear there is, for one of the bullets had entered Stolypin's liver. Despite his wounds, Stolypin heroically managed with assistance to walk out of the theater and into an ambulance, which rushed him to a first-class private clinic where he took Holy Communion and spoke lucidly. Meanwhile, his attacker, Dmitry Bagrov, a young lawyer from a prosperous Jewish family in the city, who had been both a revolutionary activist and an informer for the Okhrana, was set upon by members of the audience who would have lynched him. After Bagrov was bundled off by the police, the cast of the opera came onto the stage and joined the audience in singing the national anthem, and you can learn more about the music of the Tsars in its video on this channel. Tsar at the front of his box was obviously distressed but showing no fear. I left with the girls at 11, he later wrote to his mother. You can imagine with what emotions. Tatiana came home very tearful and is still a little shaken, whereas Olga put on a brave face throughout, and it's possible this was the start of Grand Duchess Olga carrying a gun about her, which you can learn about in its video on this channel. The following morning, the staff was surprised to see the Grand Duchesses calmer than she expected after their experience. Noticing how disconcerting this was, someone whispered, "He's already there," meaning Rasputin, who had happened to be in Kiev at the time. Then it all became clear. Hopes remained high that the Prime Minister would recover from his wounds, and the bulletin seemed favorable. They think he is out of danger, the Tsarina wrote. His liver seems to be only slightly affected. The bullet hit his Vladimir Cross and then bounced off in another direction. The Tsar was obliged to continue with his engagements in Kiev, and he attended a major review of troops with the children, followed by visits to museums and to the first school founded in Kiev. The Russian writer Nadezhda Mandelstam was an 11-year-old pupil at the time. She remembered the day vividly and how moved she had been by the sight of the very handsome boy and 4 sad girls, one of whom, the Grand Duchess Maria, was the same age as herself. I suddenly understood that I was much happier than these unfortunate girls, she wrote. After all, I could run around with the dogs on the street, make friends with the boys, not learn my lessons, make mischief, go to bed late, read all kinds of junk, and fight with my brothers and anybody else. I and my governesses had a very simple arrangement. We'd leave the house together, purposefully, and then go our separate ways. They to their rendezvous, and I to my boys. I didn't make friends with girls. You can only really fight with boys. But these poor princesses were bound in everything. They were polite, affectionate, friendly, attentive. They weren't even allowed to fight. Poor girls. The Tsar twice went to visit Stolypin, but on both occasions Stolypin's wife blamed him for the attack and refused to allow Nicholas to see him. Why? Was this indicative of deep state assassination attempts in the Russian government? In September, Stolypin died of sepsis, and Olga Stolypina declined to accept the Tsar's condolences. With martial law declared in Kiev and 30,000 troops on alert, there was an anti Jewish pogrom in retaliation, prompting many of the Jewish residents to flee the city. The Imperial family boarded their train and headed for the Black Sea coast, and the Standart, with Nicholas giving very strict instructions to the Governor General Fyodor Tropev that he would not allow a pogrom against the Jews on any pretext whatsoever, potentially out of fear for more retaliation. Bagrov was tried by military court and hung 10 days later in Kiev, despite a plea for clemency coming from Stolypin's widow herself. Having long anticipated his own violent death after the bomb attack years earlier, Stolypin asked to be buried near the place of his murder and was interred at the Peshurski monastery in Kiev. Tsarina may have mourned the manner of Stolypin's death, but she didn't mourn his loss because Stolypin had always been opposed to Rasputin and pro-populist policies. When the Imperial Party later arrived at Sevastopol en route to Livadia, bands and illuminations greeted them on the seafront. One of the ladies in waiting thought this was inappropriate, as they all did, so soon after Stolypin's assassination, and they said this to the Tsarina, who snapped, "He was only a minister, but this is the Russian emperor." This was unfathomable. She had seen how distraught the Tsarina had been and how she had comforted Stolypin's widow. What had changed her? There was only one thing I could put it down to, Sofia Chechushka concluded, convinced that the entire family was an absolute thrall to Rasputin. It was that same baleful influence which in the end destroyed the unfortunate Alexandra Fyodorova and all her family. In 1911, there were wonderful days of hiking in the hills, taking drives along the coast to a favorite picnic spot, such as St. George's Monastery, perched high on the cliffs at Cape Violent, or journeys into the Crimean heartland, past trees heavy with succulent fruit, to the Tsar's own vineyard at Massandra, which produced the finest wines in the Crimea. Day after day was spent riding and playing tennis with many imperial children, including Grand Duchess Xenia's children. Swimming was also a great favorite, although Grand Duchess Anastasia nearly drowned one day when an unexpectedly large wave hit them, and Tsar Nicholas II had to rescue her. He had had a swimming pool made of canvas sails attached to wooden posts built down at the beach for the children's safety. And we have to ask, why wasn't Andrei Derivenko watching the children, because he was posted to this explicitly? Was this yet another assassination attempt? In January 1915, an additional burden of concern was placed on the shoulders of the Romanov sisters, who were already known to be loath to the press, when Anna Varabova was seriously injured in a railway accident on the line between Petrograd and Tsarskoye Selo. Anna Varabova had provided the home by which Rasputin could meet with the Tsarina and the children in relative secrecy. She was also one of the main ladies-in-waiting to Tsarina Alexandra. Varabova was brought to the palace in a desperate state with a dislocated shoulder, double fracture of her left leg, lacerations to the right leg, and head and spine injuries. She was not expected to live. Grand Duchess Tatiana met her elderly parents and escorted them down the corridor. Valentina Chebotareva remembered that night. They sent for Grigory Rasputin. I thought this was terrible, but I could not sit in judgment on another. The woman was dying. She believes in Grigory, in his saintliness, in his prayers. He arrived in a state of fright, his disheveled beard shaking, his mouse-like eyes flitting back and forth. He grasped Dr. Gedroitz by the hand. "She'll live, she'll live." But as she later told me, I decided to play the priest at his own game, thought for a moment, and then said solemnly, "Thank you, but I will save her." Dr. Gedroit's response did not go unnoticed by the Tsar, who was home from Stavka at the time. Each to his own, he said, giving the doctor a wry smile. He spoke with the doctor for some time that evening. It seemed clear to both women that the Tsar without a doubt did not believe in either Rasputin's saintliness or his powers, but put up with him, like a sick person when exhausted by suffering clutches at straws. But Rasputin himself was visibly drained by the experience of willing Anna's recovery. He always later claimed that he had raised her from the dead, for against the odds she did recover. After 6 weeks of dedicated care, Anna was able to return home, but her recuperation was a long one, and she was disabled by her injuries for the rest of her life. Was the incident intended for the Tsarina and not Vyrabova? Alexandra broke down completely earlier in 1915 as well. Dr. Botkin ordered her to bed for 6 weeks. The nursing in the hospital and assisting at operations, tending and binding up the most hideous wounds is all less tiring than for hours visiting hospitals and talking with the poor wounded, Tsarina Alexandra wrote. She struggled on to carry on with some of her work at the annex, coming as privately and unexpectedly as possible, but it does not often succeed. One's greatest comfort is being with the dear wounded, and I miss my hospitals awfully. When her energies failed her, she read and composed reports from her sickbed, meanwhile taking lots of iron, arsenic, and heart drops. Is it any surprise later that her eldest daughter, Grand Duchess Olga, would also turn to arsenic that year? In 1916, warnings were coming thick and fast from the Tsar's own relatives, including his brother-in-law Sandro, who visited and begged the Tsar to concede to a proper democratically elected Duma, free of imperial interference. With a few words and a stroke of the pen, you could calm everything and give the country what it yearns for, he urged. And so not only did the imperial family have all of the forces against them externally, but internally from the imperial court as well. To Sandro it was clear that Alexandra's constant meddling in affairs of state was dragging her husband into an abyss, and had been for years. 10 years earlier, the court had wondered if the Tsarina was insane. Even now, she bridled at any talk of capitulation. Nicky is an autocrat. How could he share his divine right with a parliament? And then Grand Duke Mikhail, Nicholas's brother, was warning of imminent mutiny in the army if the Tsar did not immediately return to Stavka in this year of World War I. Nicholas listened to Sandro passively, as he always did, lighting one cigarette after another, literally hiding himself behind clouds of cigarette smoke. He had no stomach for a fight, either with his relatives, his wife, or his government. Those years were long past. His life was in the hands of God, and he had long since abandoned any responsibility for it. When asked where he wanted to retire to, he did not answer Russia, but England. In 1916, cadets with measles visited Alexei the Tsarevich and subsequently brought measles to the entire imperial family, which impeded their escape from Russia. And then in 1918, Kolya Derivenko also brought measles upon the imperial family. And so we have to ask ourselves if bringing viruses and illness is an established pattern for globalists and anarchists.